hope. To keep it alive during the darkest times of your life, you have to understand what it is. But too many people don't. When life's sands are shifting all around you and you need light at the end of the tunnel, this conversation may end up being one of the most important ones you've ever heard. So get yourself something to drink, sit back, and take in a great orator and brilliant thinker as we discuss hope. It's a lazy afternoon here at the 𝗕 Cafe, and I have Marc Williams with me. I am so excited about Marc Williams coming into the 𝗕 Cafe because, I'm going to be so real here. I can't even stand how real I'm going to be. There are a lot of great speakers in the world, and many of them have visited the 𝗕 Cafe for a chit-chat with your homie here. But Marc, ever since the first time I've seen him, has been, if not the best, at the absolute top level. If you ever get a chance to see Marc speak, and I have seen him speak multiple times, please, just watch. And I have a feeling that by the time this conversation's over, you will understand why I am such a Marc Williams fan. Marc, welcome to the 𝗕 Cafe.
Yes. Well, I'm also a Scott Mason fan. People should know that. I am a fan of the 𝗕.
So, hats off to you for coming up with a subject that you wanted to discuss today, which is unlike any that we have had so far, but directly pertains to leadership and everything else that this show is about. That mythical figure is Elpis, sometimes pronounced 𝗙𝗵𝗆, the Greek spirit of hope. Now, before we dive into this, I'm going to briefly share the story of 𝗙𝗵𝗆. Actually, there are two versions of it, and I have no doubt that the second, less famous version will also come up during this conversation. But I'll start with the most famous version. It shows up in an epic poem by the great Greek orator and bard 𝗙ecie, depending again on how you want to pronounce his name. And in that book, there is the story of Pandora. Human beings were originally, when created, very savage and very unenlightened, very unsophisticated. They didn't have technology. They didn't have transmissible knowledge. But they huddled around in caves at dark, and they had not been given a lot of the gifts that animals had been given. Animals were given things like feathers and fur and fangs and venom and claws to protect themselves from predators, but also to stay comfortable within the physical environment that the earth that they inhabited presented. Prometheus, sort of a trickster god, gave human beings fire. And he also taught human beings how to trick Zeus into accepting offerings that were, suffice it to say, suboptimal. Prometheus was independently punished by Zeus, the chief of the gods. But then the gods, concerned that humans with fire in hand could begin to develop technology and wisdom that would empower them to rival the deities themselves, brought a very interesting punishment upon our species. This punishment was the form of a beautiful woman named Pandora. Pandora was sent down to earth. She was an artificial human. She was created by the gods, given a spirit, and then once created, brought down to earth and given a jar. Sometimes people refer to it as a box, but it really was a jar with a tightly shut lid. And she was told, no matter what, don't open this. Yeah, I can see you shaking your head. Okay. Of course, one of the qualities that the gods had given this artificial woman, Pandora, was extreme curiosity. So, as all of us nosy, curious people will do, when told not to do something, she did it. This was a time in human history in which there really was not a lot of suffering, especially once humans had been given fire and were able to really expand their reach and their power and their comfort level within what might have otherwise been a hostile earth. When Pandora, against the gods' explicit instructions, opened up the box, every evil in the entire world escaped. Insect-like, monstrous beings is what I imagine. Things like despair, famine, war, disease, injury, plague, abuse, gossiping, all of the vices and all of the things that plague humanity to this day. Pandora was also given a conscience, and horrified and shocked by what she had done, as fast as she could, she slammed that lid shut. Everything had escaped except one thing, which was even trying to fly away when she shut the lid. It was Elpis, the spirit of hope, a beautiful young woman that we see in classical art, and the statues stand the test of time. And hope stayed locked away in that jar, where it remains to this day. Mark, why does Elpis speak to you? And does this story resonate at all?
That is such a fascinating story, and I think the reason why Elpis stands out to me is, something you said as you were telling the story. All of these vices were released into the air and into the world, except for one, right?
Yeah.
And what stands out to me, though, is that all of those vices were in the jar at once with hope. And I think when people hear the story of Pandora's box, they often only think about all of the vices and the evil that were released. To consider that, I'll use this term, consider that one of the roommates in this jar of vice was hope, speaks out to me. Because hope is a very difficult thing to exist in the absence of vice and conflict and struggle. It's a weird thing that as much as we don't want all of these things around, without those things, we don't have the most powerful peace. And what stands out to me is that when the story's told that the one thing that is still locked inside the jar is Elpis, is hope. For me, I see the jar as a heart.
Whoa.
And so as all of these other things are released outside of the world, the one thing that stays in the heart, the one thing that still stays at home, the one thing that still stays within possession, because everything runs away and goes into its own corner. But the one thing that stays in your possession, your heart, your home, is your hope. And so that's why that stands out to me so much, because that's what's closest to us. That's what holds on. That's what holds us near and dear to what we need to continue to proceed in this world. As we travel and run into these different vices, know that the one light, the one thing that's kind of keeping you going, is the one thing that stays in your jar, the one thing that stays closest to you. So That's why 𝗘𝗵𝗶 stands out to me. I love the word hope.
That was deep, but it was deep because of something that you said behind it all, right at the beginning. All of the evils sprung out of the heart. The jar was the heart. Do you believe, or should we explore, if you're ambivalent, as to whether all of the vices and the sufferings and the horrible things that we bring into the world actually do have their locus in the heart?
You know, that's a really, really good question. And I don't know why. I'm probably going to go into my English teacher years. But I remember teaching _𝗏𝗏𝗲. I don't know if you ever read that?
I have, but not since I was in junior high. And I know that many of the people who are watching this have not. So please give a summary, and this will give us a chance to get a taste of some of your own storytelling skills.
You've got, way before the concept of survivor, you've got a group of kids on a trip whose plane crashes and lands on an island, and the only adult dies. And so these young boys who don't know where they are, who don't know how to get out of this situation, ultimately build a society. And at first, they're all innocent kids until they start to split and some of the vices come out. The teasing, the bullying, the hunting. At a certain point, all of the boys, with the exception of 2 or 3, hunt the other kids. They even call one of the kids Piggy. So they're hunting this pig of a kid. And it's at the end of the story when the island is burning and they've caused all of this destruction that they are finally rescued. And when the adults get there, they can't believe what they've seen. And what the story ultimately tells the tale of is that even in our greatest innocence lies, it's got to have a really hard time with the word evil. I'll say within all of us lies some vices. And sometimes those vices come out of certain needs and values and you know, listen, kids who were chasing another kid were probably suffering from some kind of insecurities or hunger or desperation. And, you know, they just went a way that you never would have thought that they went. So when I speak about 𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗲, it reminds me of, and now I'm going to fast forward to one of my favorite speakers, Les Brown. And he talks about the power of the word yes and the power of the word no. And he tells a story about applying for a job, and the advice he was told was, keep asking, because for every 7 no's, there's 1 yes. Vices outnumber hope, but they live within us. They live within us. You know, so yes, vices are in the heart too.
If the jar is indeed the heart, perhaps that explains another curious thing about hope that you indirectly reference and that the story isn't clear about. You said that hope lives inside the heart, the jar, with the vices, and that that hope can't really exist without the vices. Would we want to experience a life without our vices? Would, in that case, it be worth not having hope?
The answer for me, I feel like I'm making all kinds of references today, Scott.
You beating the myth slayer at his own game?
The reference that comes to mind for me is the movie Inside Out 2.
I have never seen it.
Well, I've had opportunity to see both of them, so I guess this is actually a reference to both of them. And in short, the movie is really about all of the different emotions that this young child and really any adult have. We've got the anger, we've got the sadness, we got the fear, the anxiety, the joy. There's two particular emotions that really stood out to me. At the beginning of the movie, joy was trying to always cheer up sadness. And that seemed like such a noble thing. But then we get close to the end of the movie, and the young girl in the movie is so sad that she wants to run away from home. And as she thinks about life without her parents, she goes back home, and her parents hug her with all of the love that they can. And it was at that moment that happiness realized, I should not be trying to make sadness joyful. Because without sadness, I would not be reminded of why I need to be happy. We need sadness, we need fear, we need depression, we need anger, we need joy. We need so hard to say things like we need a famine. But we need problems and we need vices, because those types of things give us the hope to do things better. See, here's how I see it. If all you have are the vices, or rather, if all you have is the hope and the joy, and we're happy with the way things are, we might not really progress in life. Mm-hmm. The vices actually spark our creativity for how to solve those problems. Life needs evolution, and we don't evolve without the vices. We don't progress without the vices. So the vices are really important. And I would say that even though the hope is outnumbered, the hope is probably still more powerful than the collective vices. But the hope does not exist without the vices. So would I want to live in a world where there is just joy and hope? As weird as it sounds, I guess not.
You're raising some almost existential questions here. And I'm just going to throw out some thoughts, any of which you are invited to follow, and all of which you're invited to follow. First, what you're talking about actually at an foundational level really challenges a lot of modern religious beliefs. Because a lot of the modern belief systems, and the Greeks had a version of this as well, but it wasn't as fully fleshed out as as the current major religions, at least the monotheistic religions, have in place, which is that you die, you go to heaven, to paradise, and you don't ever suffer again. Now, we sort of take that for granted because as something that's desirable, because superficially it sounds great. But you are right. If you're sitting around in heaven for 10 trillion years, and that's just the beginning, and there's never any problem that you need to solve or any challenge that you have, is that really an afterlife worth having? the Greeks did say, for instance, if you were a hero, you ended up not living in the normal underworld, which was kind of grim and gloomy, but you went to a place that was like paradise. But even there, you had the opportunity to travel back and forth to our world, which had its share of problems, and you had mortals calling on you in order to be able to help solve those problems. But then thinking about that even further, the Greek world of Pandora, like I mentioned earlier, didn't have problems at all. It advanced because of the technological solution or the technological gifts that Prometheus had given via fire, but without problems, humans would not have been able to aspire. And so really, I guess another potential rabbit hole that I'm throwing out here to you is it essential, since we're talking about leadership as a fundamental theme of this podcast, for leaders to have the dark within as something to struggle with so that they themselves can have that sense of joy, ambition, hope?
You know, you had me until you said the dark within. I'm like, ooh, do I want them to have the dark within? And yet I have to face reality. You know, the truth is we probably all got some darkness within, you know? And I think if I were to accept this truth, and maybe I'll flip it because maybe it makes me feel a little bit more comfortable to say it this way. I kind of see that darkness within as the flaws within, right? We've all got our human flaws, you know, and we all live in a world where even with our best intentions, there's always an up and a downside to it. There's always like, I did this and everybody thought it was great, except for Scott.
Exactly.
Right? And because we live in a world where everybody's so different, like at some point, even the best things to somebody will seem like a bad thing. And so I think we all have this darkness or this flaw within that we're always, well, some of us are trying to keep it inside. Some of us just let the darkness out.
We just let her rip.
Yeah. But I also think that we're always a work in progress. And that's how we see humanity. We're always a work in progress. And without the darkness within, there's no need to progress. And so I would say that we all need a little bit of darkness and a little flaw within us in order to get better. Yeah, you know, it's funny. I even think about the example you gave a little bit earlier about heaven and hell. And I think, but would hell, or rather, would heaven be so desirable if there was nothing to compare it to? And so, yeah, we need that darkness within because we need something to uplift us, something to progress, something that we can compare so that, and this is another word that came up for me, Scott, as you were talking about it. I think my gratitude comes from knowing that even when I mess up, even when I let that dark side come out, that my hope drives me to do something that may overcome that. And I'm grateful. I become grateful for the hope, and I become grateful for the darkness. It's yin and yang, and I don't really know much about yin and yang. But at the end of the day, there's a weird, shall I call it, harmony between lightness and darkness. There's this interesting harmony between heroes and villains, between good and evil. I used the word roommate earlier.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Because that's what Hope and Vice is. They're roommates. They're Felix Unger and Oscar Madison. I just really threw a reference out there.
I was gonna say, well, that's some old school. You and I, look, Mark. Between the two of us, we cannot be, over 35. So, I don't know where you pulled that from. Your mama must have told you about that when you were a little boy. That's how I heard about it. I'm way too young to have ever heard of that on my own. Well, I'm going to tack back, though, to something that you said earlier, which is too good of a nugget to resist. When a guest like you throws out catnip, then moves on, I have to bite. I just have to. I just have to claw at it. And that is, you said you have a problem with the word evil. Because tying this theme of darkness into leadership, there are leaders that are commonly described as evil. Now, I'm not going to go into the obvious cases. Yes, Adolf Hitler is white, like the one that, or Stalin or someone like that, immediately comes to mind. But let's go to something a little bit more mundane. Some people, for instance, describe social media titans as evil. Some people describe Jeff Bezos and Amazon as an evil overlord. Sometimes people just simply describe monstrous bosses as evil. I have had bosses that were so tyrannical, to me at least, and so micromanaging or so driven by, I don't know, some of these virtues that Pandora let out, some of these vices that Pandora let out into the world, that I cannot help but describe them as evil, or at least as being evil in their actions. But you're having me question, when you say something like, I have a problem with the word evil, whether that sort of categorical way of viewing leadership is really helpful. So talk to me a little bit more about what you meant when you said you have a challenge with the word evil, and how that would relate to leadership or anything that I've just shared.
I think the inner 𝗘𝗆ce in me is so hopeful, so optimistic, so positive, that I've been accused of seeing the good intentions in many things. And so the word evil for me reeks of seeing bad intentions. And it's not that I don't think that people don't have bad intentions. And maybe I'm naive in this, Scott, but I believe that even people who do evil things, some of them, maybe not all of them, but I think some of them believe that they're doing it for the right reason. Mm-hmm. Maybe it's attached to some value that they feel is right. I mean, we've been in a world where there are some people who've done some really, really bad things. And yet, some of those people will say that they're doing it in the name of fill in the blank, right? Even people, I remember sitting in history class and learning about kamikazes, right? And it's like, well, I flew my, plane, or I drove my tank into something in the name of, right? And so some people believe that there's a good intention, and maybe they are warped or what have you. But I think that's why I have such an issue with the word, or I have such a discomfort with the word evil, because my brain just sees that maybe that evil has been a little bit misunderstood. I kind of see these evil, dark vices that we have as these misunderstood children in our souls. You know, and I guess I'll tap into just being an educator for a second.
Please.
You know, we always say there's no such thing as a bad child, but there is a bad behavior, right? And the reason why we say that is because there are so many other components that factor in to what the child has done. But the child, him, her, themselves, it's not evil. But what they've done is wrong or evil or bad. So I feel that sometimes the inner vice, the inner evil, the inner dark side is just something that's misunderstood. I mean, Scott, think about it. We've all had a disagreement with somebody.
Yeah.
And I can speak for disagreements that I've had with people, that if they thought I was wrong, it was probably because there was something they did not understand. And I've come to learn that when I thought somebody was wrong, it was because of something I did not understand. There was this detail that was hard for me to see because I only see the world through my lens. And I can't even understand or fathom why somebody would do something like that, because it's not something I would do. But I don't share the same lived experiences as every other person. So that doesn't necessarily mean that the other person is evil or bad or wrong. It just means that they're misunderstood.
Another less famous version of the Pandora story, which I referenced earlier, is that the box actually didn't contain evils, but all of the virtues in the world. And when Pandora opened the box, all of the virtues in the world flew out and became inaccessible to humans, except hope. And I can't help but think about that when you talk about children and thinking about vices and behaviors versus what's in the heart, from the perspective of a child. But the behaviors that might seem evil or that might be described as evil in a child, many times we can dismiss because children have not gone through the maturation process. And we can hope that as they grow up, they develop better judgment, they developed a higher level of critical and reasoning thinking skills, and that they morally and ethically develop. Adults, then, when they behave in these ways, particularly when they are leaders and they have influence, you know, hearing this, I, again, can't help but think, are these leaders really exhibiting a lack of maturation? And to what extent, then, should we be looking at and openly discussing things like ethical maturation as a qualification for leadership?
And yet, for me, first of all, I agree with that concept. I love the concept of ethical maturation. My wondering around that is, ethics, like values, might differ from person to person. I don't know if we live in a world where everyone can agree on what it means to be ethical. I don't know if we live in a world where everyone can agree on what we should value. It's the complexity of humanity. I'm gonna write that one down. That's the complexity of humanity, that we're all so different, right? And even as you were talking about, like, the difference between, yeah, you're right, a child hasn't fully developed through lived experiences yet. And yet there are some adults, because of the experiences that they've gone through, maybe that's why they haven't matured to the same level as a Scott. You know? Maybe.
If that is the case, do you think that, and again, sort of tying back to what you said a few minutes ago about the vices all sitting within the general neighborhood of our heart, and the fact that what our values are may reasonably differ, is it possible to be an ethical or mature leader at all? How do you know what values to follow? And where do you draw that from? And, you know, that's something that I have to ask you in particular as an educator, because I would imagine, again, correct me if I'm wrong, but part of educating a child is not only, I mean, there are those that say school is for the 3 R's, and that's it. Don't have PE, don't have drama, don't have band, or all of that. And if you can't measure it, then it doesn't exist. But then there are those, and I know you well enough to know that I just don't believe that you think that is ethical, moral, citizenry-ish education part of the responsibility of an educator? And if so, is that also part of the education that a leader needs to engage in once they're an adult?
So the answer is yes. Our schools are not as effective if we're only doing reading, writing, and arithmetic. We're dealing with young lives, and we are sometimes the adults that they see for longer periods of the day than anybody else. And children pay very close attention to what the adults are doing. It may seem that they're not always listening to what we're saying, but children will be the first to point out, but you did this, you did that, right? They see what you do. And so a lot of times our values, our ethics, our morals are not really simply expressed through our words, but they're expressed through our actions and our behaviors. So whether we want to go beyond reading, writing, and arithmetic, we are no matter what, right? Those are things, if we were to go with the box or the jar, I may only want to let out the reading, the writing, and the arithmetic. But there's other stuff coming out of that jar and coming into that jar, right? That's just the way that we work. So it is our responsibilities as adults, and I don't just mean teachers in the classroom. I believe every adult in a child's life is an educator. They are teaching intentionally or unintentionally, subconsciously or consciously. They're teaching morals and values and ethics to our children, right? What I would add to this, and I would love to get your thoughts on this, is I think the roadblock in life has been that we sort of stop at what are my values, what are my ethics, what are my morals? When in actuality, I believe that I need to find out what you value, Scott. I need to find out what your ethics are, and I need to find out what your morals are. And I have to understand that though ours might not match up, being aware of what yours are is really important for us to get along.
You know, you just kind of blew open Pandora's box again. And, you know, the reason why I'm saying that is because thinking about what you were saying before you asked that question, as you were talking about how students watch the teacher and observe everything that they do and take cues accordingly, one of the things that emerging leaders often forget is that their staff do the exact same thing. Because I suspect the initial organizational, outside of the family, hierarchies that we're exposed to are within school, people learn about the interrelationship between the authority figure, the leader, and the follower, i.e. the student, through the interactions and engagements that they observe in school. And so literally part of why I am interested in what educators have to say about leadership is because what leadership is shown in these early stages, practically every leader in history, at least in modern history, has gone through school, even if it's just for a day or two. And so, right, practically everyone has had this universal exposure experience to leadership, and if you've had multiple teachers of different styles and sorts and having different impacts on your life. And if you're on a stage, well, it can be easy to forget that, especially, and by on a stage, I'm referring to in particular teachers that are standing in front of the classroom that are speakers over and over again and putting on a show for their students. Hopefully they are somehow entertaining them enough so they don't fall asleep and they actually learn their lessons, but that they are themselves actually engaging in an interplay and understanding and knowing their values, or what values they're coming with from their own family, could perhaps help them teach more effectively or throw different things into the mix. And then transferring that analogy yet again into large organizational leadership structures, it is true. How many times are organizational leaders told by the highest ups in the organizations, this is what our mission is, this is what our vision is, these are what our values are, you pass them on to the staff and the staff will buy into them, or the staff acts accordingly. It's told in this very directive sort of way without really thinking, well, the staff may be parroting these words because they need money or they don't want to get fired, but they may not really share those values. And if there is that misalignment, you've got challenge. Look, when I work with clients on leadership coaching projects, I actually do, and I'm glad you raised this, ask the clients to both understand their values as leaders of that organization within that context, as well as their own values as a leader independent of that organization. And if there's misalignment, well, a lot of times that's why people aren't behaving in a way that is as effective as possible within that organization as leaders. But I, again, thinking a step further, and are you also in this mix of values consideration thinking about the people that you're leading? Are you even taking the time to ask?
You know, here's what this reminds me of. I don't know if you've ever heard this, Scott, but it is often recommended for organizations to identify their values.
Yeah.
Right? And then I remember reading somewhere that an organization should not have any more than 3 to 5 values. Right? Because it gets convoluted, I guess, if you have more than 3 to 5. But here's my pushback on that. Let's say we're a team of 30 people. There are countless values out there. I mean, I often reference the book Dare to Lead by Brené Brown, and I don't think she invented the list, but in that book is a list of 100 values. And there's even a spot at the bottom of the list where you can add more, right? Because the implication is there's an, I don't know if there's an infinite number of values, but there's a whole lot of values in humanity. If as an organization, we only identify 3 to 5 values in an organization of 30 plus people, then isn't there a chance that those values don't represent the entire community? And so I often ask organizations that I've worked with, let's identify some of the top values from all of the individuals. And let's not limit ourselves to 3 to 5. Let's put everything on the board. I'm sure we'll see some commonalities. But if there's 30 people in your room, then those are the values. Those are the ethics. Those are the morals that bring this community together. You know, I got to tell you, Scott, oh man, this is such an inspiring conversation, because when I think back to the Pandora story, what I'm wondering is the greatest tragedy in that story might not be the unleashing of the evils and vices into the world, but it might be the separation between the vices and the hope. This is what happens to the world where you separate the two. And we live in a world where we're always separating everything, and it's got to go in this box or this category. And if you don't believe the way that I believe, then you're a them and not a us. And we're always separating. You can't separate. That was the biggest tragedy. That the whole family of, let's call it virtues. The whole family of virtues in that jar was separated. We can't separate. We got to bring people together. You got to understand why people operate the way that they do. And for leaders, this is so important, that leaders cannot simply impose upon their teams what the values, what the ethics, what the morals are. They've got to find out the morals, the ethics, the virtues, the vices that everybody brings into the community, because that affects the community.
And it goes back yet again to your comment about evil, because if you are willing to take that leap and with an open mind hear why someone's values may contain elements that you see as vices, perhaps there's room for an understanding or reconsideration of your own values. I just also have to say 2 things. First of all, that separation. I love that point, because, you know, one thing that's often forgotten about the Pandora story is that the world that was created by the opening of her box, by the separation of hope from the heart, hope from the values and values from the heart, led to society spinning so out of control that Zeus sent their version of Noah's flood and wiped out humanity altogether, just saving 2 people who happened to be in an ark. And so that, to me, symbolically does reinforce the catastrophic consequences of unchecked separation of these elements and of people from their true selves. But then also, I have to go back to the conversation about, again, about evil, because perhaps if you are viewing your own staff and their values, even without necessarily openly understanding it, but maybe simply because you didn't bother to explore what those values are. And you might be saying, well, this is wrong, or this is evil, or this is against our values, especially if you only have 3 to 5, which is really shallow. You know, you may actually then be creating the sort of division, or you might actually be precluding consideration of something that you might have thought was evil, but actually could take your organization or your leadership in a different direction. You also may be assuming, because you're not considering other people's values, that something that you consider yourself to be good, when in fact it might, in the eyes of many, be seen as evil. And maybe that is the explanation for a lot of these companies whose founders seem to, picking on the tech space because it's the easiest target, but it's in other areas too, where they seem to be good people and say things that express hope to have their company be part of a better world, but really then have outcomes that are evil. If they've never reconsidered their own thinking or their own values, they've just dictated it and everyone mindlessly goes along, that could be a consequence.
Since we're picking on tech tycoons, I don't know everybody's story. I haven't studied the full biography of the Jeff Bezos, the Elon Musk, the Bill Gates, so forth and so on. But they were all children at some point.
Yeah.
They've all had some lived experience at some point. And they were all exposed to what I think it's I'm going to mess up his name. I know he wrote the book, The Millionaire Mindset.
Mm-hmm.
All of those tycoons, just like all of us, were exposed to a blueprint when we were children. In The Millionaire Mindset, he encourages his readers to ask, what was the blueprint that you were exposed to when you were a child when it came to money? What did you see adults do when it came to money? How did you see them manage money? And without realizing it, what you saw became your blueprint. Some of us didn't see a lot of money. And as a result, that affects the way we do things, how we do things. And people who don't have the same experience, they don't separate their lived experience from our lived experience. And so it goes back to, I love this phrase you came up with, unchecked separation. We're so busy separating everything and separating ourselves and separating good for evil that we're not looking for what happens when you bring all of these things together, right? Like when you think about it, Pandora's box. So how would that myth have been different if she had let out everything, including hope, right? Because when you think about it, that's ultimate. It's like what I said, the evil, the true tragedy is that they were separated. But what if they weren't separated? What if hope was spread throughout the world, just like everything else?
I can't help but wonder as I'm listening to this question, Mark, do you think that someone can be a leader if they have separated from their own hope, if they have no hope?
Man, that's a great philosophical question. See why they pay you all the big bucks.
I mean, the reason I wonder is like there's always the office cynic. And can an office cynic, I always argue an office cynic really can't lead because they don't have hope. And so what are you following? But then thinking about this, well, what if hope had never been separated from the evil? What if hope was somehow sublimated or devoured by all of the evils too? Because it wasn't kept in that jar. It wasn't kept in the heart, right? There are leaders that peddle cynicism, but even the cynicism that they peddle is often garbed in hope because they say, look, everything is awful. The United States is terrible. England is terrible. Our country is terrible. Our entire industry is in dire straits. We will save you. And therefore, even if the overall outlook that they're addressing is hopeless, they promise that light of hope to change it around, even if sometimes this hope is a bunch of BS. That being said, yes, you're wagging your finger at me, so I got it. I know you got something to say, and I want to hear it.
What you just said, I think, answers the question for me. Even the cynic has hope. They may not be hoping for what I'm hoping for. They may not be hoping for what you're hoping for, but they still have hope. My goodness. All right, here's another reference. Have you seen the Avenger movies?
Some.
All right.
Not a huge fan, but I've seen some of them, of course. Hey, I am a modern day American. Yes.
There you go.
How could I avoid that?
Well, what stands out to me about the Avengers movies is the ultimate villain in that movie was Thanos. And his desire to basically eliminate, I wouldn't even say it's the human race. I think he was really trying to eliminate all races of living beings across the universe because he wanted to start all over. He felt that every living being really was contaminating this world or this universe, and he wanted to destroy everything and start all over again. That's a very weird way of saying that even the most evil person had a hope. That even the most evil person, in a very warped way, had some kind of a good intention. I don't think that it's the vice or the hope per se. Maybe it's how we carry things out. You know, maybe that's really what it is. It's not the vice or the virtue. It's how we carry things out.
Or perhaps, to add on to that, how we communicate. And that leads me into a part of this discussion that I wanted to be sure that we went into. You mentioned that you have a speaker academy, and that presumably, and I know you'll talk to us a little bit more about that at the end of the hour, is related to communications. Otherwise, why would it be called Speaker Academy? And you are a speaker, so you communicate. To what extent do you feel that hope or its absence can impact the ability or the outcomes that a leader is connected to when they communicate?
I think communication is such an important component to all of this, because I think what we often struggle with as individuals, as leaders, as people on teams, I think sometimes we struggle to communicate, one, what we're hoping for, two, why we're hoping for it, three, how we would like for those hopes to happen. And once you start adding all of that, that makes it so complicated. And then we're so worried, and maybe I'll speak for myself sometimes. I love to be a great communicator, but there are still aspects of life that I need to still work on my own communication on. I think we get so caught up and concerned about what other people are going to think about what we've expressed, that we don't express it. And I've been making a lot of references today. I'll make another one. John Gordon, I heard him speak once, and one of the things he said really stood out to me, that as humans, we have this tendency to want to fill in the blanks. So if you don't say everything that's on your mind, I'm going to fill in the blanks, right? And sometimes, and you know, as much as I am Mr. Good Intentions, Mr. Hope, Mr. Elpis, I do understand that sometimes we fill in the blanks with the worst intentions. And Scott, I read something a long time ago in the New York Times that really explained why people are so negative. And the argument was that it's really just a survival tool to protect ourselves. Because if I'm super positive and optimistic and joyful and happy, then if something happens, I wasn't prepared for it. But if I'm famine, if I'm anger, if I'm this, if I'm that, then I fortified myself so that if the worst thing happens, I'm good. And so there's something innate in us, and I think we keep coming back to that theme. There's something innate in us that wants to feel protected, that wants to survive, that wants to move on. And so we plug in sometimes the bad intentions, the worst intentions, when we don't hear all of the details. And that's done to protect us. But at the end of the day, what's really harming us is we're not communicating. And as leaders in particularly, I think not only do we have to, but we have to encourage those that we lead to tell us, what are you feeling? What are you valuing? Why are you valuing it that? And actually, let me even say, why is such a judgmental word? I've heard this before, but what's the story? We talk about storytelling, Scott. What's the story behind why that value or that behavior or that feeling or that vice or that virtue? What is the story behind what makes that so important for you? We're not communicating these things, and then we're making up the answers. And that's where we're getting into a lot of trouble.
I think about times in my own history as a leader in which I behaved, I'm ashamed to admit, but I'm going to be honest about, in a way that was tyrannical. And usually it was the sort of situation that we've described above, where I had an idea or a set of values or an initiative that I wanted to have in place, and I imposed it on everyone. I threw out my idea or my directive, and I would, as a token matter, say, what do you all think about it? Now, some of my staff members were usually bold enough to give an honest opinion that dissented, but sometimes they intuitively sensed that the answer was going to be yes. And I'll never forget one time I was in a leadership position, and the person at the top of the organization I was working for said, we're going to do XYZ initiative. I don't care what you think, we're going to do it, but now is your chance to just give me your thoughts, but know that we're going to do it anyway. So, of course, all of us, first of all, everyone in the room knew that this was a terrible idea. But we all were just like, okay, well, since it's going to happen anyway, why waste our time and energy fighting it? And so we all just praise it, and then immediately went into our offices and we're like, yeah, I didn't mean a single word I said, but he needed to hear it. So we gave it to him. Okay, we've got our job tomorrow. And of course, it ended up being a bad idea. Unfortunately, the organization didn't go forward with it because it became apparent even to that particular leader that it was a bad idea. But that's not optimal. I could relate to him as much as I was irritated with him, like I mentioned earlier, because of my own tyrannical times. When you have that idea that you're holding on to, it's almost like a creative project. You know, I'm writing some books now, and I get scared to tell people about them because I'm afraid of rejection. There's that vulnerability. When you have your idea or this thing that you want to do or this program that you want to throw out as a leader, you're vulnerable. And so talking about what you said earlier, you act to protect yourself by imposing this tyranny on you, and then people don't respond. And you probably don't want them to respond because the need to feel protected overrides everything. Then I think about a lot of the students that educators I know face, because I don't know any educator, and maybe you're the exception to this, Mark, who doesn't work with kids or who has never worked with the kids who don't have some sort of difficulty in their background, right? And they sometimes, probably more than anyone, need protection. They have that vulnerability, and they may not be able to hear or be very frightened to hear this critique about their own behaviors. How do we help people develop the sense of, I don't know, maybe inner protection or inner security, so that they can actually check in, whether it's with regards to values or a specific initiative, and hear what their people are really thinking, especially if, again, it's rooted in values that are radically divergent from theirs? How can people develop that fortitude to be that sort of communicator that opens up the doors for that?
You know, Scott, I'd be lying to you if I said I've got it all figured out. I don't think anyone. But I say that because while I believe that this is still a challenge for me, you know, as a leader, as a husband, as a father, as a friend, you know, as a human, what speaks to me when you answer that question is be comfortable letting everything out of the jar. The protection comes from not letting everything out. Pandora thought that she was protecting the rest of the world by closing the lid and not letting everything out. And I don't profess that to be easy. It's hard for us to let everything out. But maybe the misconception is that if you keep some things in to protect yourself, that you're protecting yourself. Maybe letting everything out is the true protection. Maybe. We ought to give it a try.
Letting everything out is the true protection. Having the courage to understand that the values you and your organization have committed to may not be as virtuous as you think they are. Separating yourself from your values. Holding hope and understanding it as living in the same heart space as everything else. These are deep takeaways. And when I think about what leadership means, I think about hope. I think about communication. I think about inner darkness, or even what I consider values that are indisputable. I have to say, this conversation has forced some reframing. Like you said, I don't know it all. I don't think any of us know it all. But if we're sitting here honestly thinking about it, wrestling with the gods and the demons, maybe the takeaway I leave today with is that that's how we become leaders that can better inspire hope within those that we lead, and maybe even drive some outcomes that are epic. If there is a single takeaway that you'd like to reiterate, or something that you didn't get a chance to say that you wanted to, Mark, I would love to hear it.
What hits me in my heart right now that I would want to share, it really hits home, to lead with hope. before you explain what's in your heart or in your mind, express first what it is that you hope for yourself and for the others, and then get into everything else. Lead with hope. Let hope out of the jar first, and then let everything else that needs to come out. But lead the conversation with the hope that you have for yourself and for everyone around you. Maybe that will create the empathy that we all need to deal with the vices and the evils and the darkness that we all bring into this world. Let hope out first.
We need leaders that are prepared to step up and solve those problems. Marc, tell us about any projects that you're working on and where people can find out more about you and follow you.
Proudest project that I could tell you about right now is my sister Kathy and I have created the Speaker Skills Academy, because we've discovered that the best way to get better at anything, including speaking, and when I say speaking, I don't just mean standing up in front of a room. We all open our mouths and talk and communicate, as we've discussed, in all walks of life. The best way to become better at something is by practicing it. So at Speaker Skills Academy, we don't give you a stage to step on to speak. We give you a ton of different skills, and then we come in and then we drill a particular skill over and over and over and over again. And there's no feedback, there's no judgment, there's just a group of people getting together and working on the skills to be better at communicating. It's not a workshop series, it's a community. And the best thing about this community is not what we're learning from each other, but it's what we're learning about each other. Gotta come and check out Speaker Skills Academy. We do guest passes all the time. Website is going to be launched very soon, speakerskillsacademy.com. But in the meantime, I don't even live in the world of my own website anymore. Check me out on LinkedIn, Marc Williams Speaks at LinkedIn. That's where the heavy traffic is going, so find me there. And I'd love to get in touch with you, whether it's to coach you, speak to you, train you, be in community with you. Marc Williams, like I said at the beginning, I'm a fan.
People like you give me hope. Thank you, Marc. And I will have all of those links in the caption below. Appreciate you being here. This has been really quite a little adventure here at the 𝗕𝗏𝗄𝗃 Cafe. And I could not imagine having done this series without having you on as fast as I could get you. So appreciate that. For those of you who enjoyed this episode, be sure to subscribe to this channel and also press the thumbs up button below and leave a comment. If you have a mythical figure that you would like us to discuss and analyze and dig deep on, also share that with us at some point or another in the comments. And then if you have a leadership question that you would like us to run through the 𝗕𝗏𝗆𝗃 Cafe Discussion Center, then leave that in the comments as well. Also, be sure to go to my website, myfreedomrocks.com. That's myfreedomrocks.com. That URL is in the caption. And then check out my social media sites that are in the caption as well. And come back next time for another great conversation on myths, leadership, and life at the 𝗕𝗏𝗆𝗃 Cafe.